Welcome to the debate. Today we are unpacking the complex and honestly sometimes totally baffling mechanics of English past and perfect tenses. We're drawing directly from a really fascinating collection of linguistic source materials.
Yeah, it's a pretty dense topic.
It really is. We are going to examine the rules surrounding the past perfect continuous, the present perfect continuous, this whole concept of aspect, and, well, precise verb usage. But we aren't just doing a dry textbook grammar lesson today. We are looking at this through a highly contested lens.
Exactly.
The central question we're exploring today is this. Is the primary function of these complex English tenses to map precise chronological sequences? Like, do they essentially serve as a mathematical GPS timestamp for events? Or, conversely, is their primary function to convey the speaker's subjective psychological perspective, acting more like a camera lens that reflects how an action is actually experienced? I will be arguing that these tenses are fundamentally an objective, chronological framework. They are the rigid GPS data of our language.
And I'll be taking the opposing view. I'm arguing like tenses are primarily a tool of what linguists call aspect. They reflect the speaker's subjective perspective, their narrative intent, and the current relevance of an action. If your view is the raw GPS data, my view is the camera lens, zooming in to show the emotion of a duration or panning out to show a finished event.
It's a great framing. Let's jump right into the position statements. Look, for me, complex tenses exist fundamentally to solve a basic problem, which is chronological chaos. Without a rigid structural framework, language just loses its objective sequence. If we look at the source material's explanation of the past perfect continuous tense, we see a highly specific, almost mathematical formula at play.
Mathematical is a pretty strong word for human language.
But it really is. The material defines its main use as focusing on the duration of an ongoing action up until another specific action in the past. Take the example provided. I had been working at the company for 5 years before I got promoted. The tense provides precise temporal coordinates. It tells us the duration, 5 years, and it establishes a strict boundary, which is the promotion. The rules dictate that had been belongs exclusively to the past of the past. If there is no connection to the present, you must use had been. The present perfect continuous, using have been, explicitly connects to the present. These aren't subjective choices based on vibes, they are objective geometric markers on a timeline. They ensure that the listener knows exactly when something happened in relation to everything else.
I have to push back on that immediately. Viewing verbs purely as points on a rigid timeline completely ignores that concept of aspect I mentioned earlier. Our material explicitly defines aspect as how the verb is experienced, namely as a completed action or as still in progress. The choice of tense is much less about the exact clock time something happened, and far more about the speaker's psychological framing of the event.
How so? I mean, if an event happens at 9 p.m., it happens at 9 p.m.
Right.
But our sources provide a perfect illustration of how time alone doesn't dictate the tense. Two sentences can occur at the exact same chronological time, yet use totally different tenses. Think about he will arrive at 9 p.m. versus he will be arriving at 9 p.m. Chronologically, both point to 9 p.m. tomorrow. The GPS coordinates are identical. But the first focuses strongly on the event as a definite, unyielding fact. The second, will be arriving, is less definite, it's softer or viewed as a temporary action. The grammar allows us to shape the reality of the action. Whether we view a situation as temporary, permanent, or possessing ongoing relevance to us right now, that is what actually dictates the tense. Aspect allows us to bend your rigid timeline to fit human experience.
Okay, I'll concede that will be arriving softens the tone, but let's look closely at how the perfect continuous tenses function in practice, particularly in the past. Because down in the trenches of past events, these tenses act as strict chronological boundary markers.
Give me an example.
The material offers this one. They had been waiting for the bus when it suddenly started raining. The entire job of the past perfect continuous in that sentence is to show a sequence of events where a long, ongoing action is cut off or bounded by a shorter past action. To translate this like I'm 5, the grammar physically builds a fence around the action. It tells the listener, this event is over, it's boxed up, put it on the historical shelf. The waiting happened and then the rain interrupted it. This is a sequence of past events. The rule is absolute. If there is no connection to the present, you cannot use have been. You must use had been because the story belongs completely to the past. It is a sequencing tool first and foremost.
Okay, a fence analogy is clever, but it's incomplete. You're treating the tense like it's just sorting historical inventory. But look at the cause and effect usages detailed in our sources. The timeline approach is simply too sterile. It misses the explanatory power of the tense. The text gives us this example. I noticed he had gained weight because he had been eating a lot of junk food.
Which perfectly illustrates my point. The eating preceded the weight gain. That is sequence.
Hold on a second, let me finish the thought. Yes, both actions are in the past, but the speaker isn't just plotting points on a graph here. They are connecting a past duration to a past visible effect. Let's modernize the example a bit to make it relatable. Imagine I say, he was exhausted because he had been hitting the gym twice a day, or he felt sick because he had been eating biryani every single night. The tense is being used to present evidence.
But it is still chronological evidence.
It's deeper than that. And this becomes even more obvious with the present perfect continuous. Think about the passive aggression in a text message. If I text you, I waited for an hour. That's a historical fact, maybe I'm over it. But if I text you, I have been waiting for an hour, that is an emotional accusation. The chronological start date isn't what matters. What matters is the effect violently crashing into the present moment. The grammar is doing the heavy lifting of my annoyance. The material states that the present perfect continuous is used for actions where the result has surfaced. That means the speaker's perception of the present reality overrides strict timekeeping.
Okay. I've definitely been on the receiving end of the have been waiting text, and you do immediately feel the weight of it. I can't deny that. But here is where your argument falters. The emotional weight of that text is only logically sound because the chronological sequence is intact. You cannot have an effect without a strictly ordered cause. The objective timeline provides the necessary foundation for the speaker to even make that passive-aggressive connection.
I'm not saying the timeline doesn't exist. I'm saying it's secondary to the aspectual intent.
Let me present another area where objective rules ruthlessly govern our expression, regardless of the speaker's intent. State of verbs. The text outlines verbs of emotion, comprehension, perception, and relationship. Verbs like hate, believe, know, belong. The grammar strictly enforces objective logical limits on these words.
You're talking about how they can't be used in the continuous form?
Exactly. You cannot use progressive forms for stable states. The text notes we do not say, I am hating coffee. You must say, I hate coffee. This proves that English tenses are governed by rigid structural rules about what an action objectively is. If a state is objectively stable in the real world, the grammar outright refuses to let you portray it as an ongoing, progressive action. The chronological reality of the state dictates the grammar, not the speaker's whim. Your camera lens doesn't get to zoom in and make a permanent state look temporary.
Wait, what? You think state of verbs prove your point? They'd actually prove mine. Look at the exact counterexamples provided in that very same section of the source material.
I'm listening.
You are right that state of verbs generally resist progressive forms, but the material explicitly points out that these verbs change their meanings entirely if they are used progressively. The source contrasts the sentence, I think the answer is wrong, with I am thinking about the answer.
Right. One is an opinion, the other is an action.
Precisely. In the first, think is a stative verb representing a stable opinion. In the second, thinking is an active progressive consideration. Now, imagine a person sitting quietly at a desk looking at a math problem. The objective action in the real world looks exactly the same. Your GPS timestamp records the exact same physical reality. But the speaker's internal perspective, whether they view their thought as a permanent state of belief or a temporary active process of deduction, is what actually dictates the grammar. This proves that aspect bends the rules to fit human experience. The speaker's psychological framing overrides the rigid categorization of the verb.
But the clever pivot, but the only reason you can do that is because the grammar requires a structural shift to accommodate the new meaning. It's not a free-for-all, where you just impose your feelings on the verb. It's a precise mathematical substitution. You swap the simple form for the continuous form to signal a different objective reality.
But the reality is subjective.
Let's step back and look at the most basic binary presented in our materials. Been versus gone. This is the perfect distillation of my argument. The text provides a remarkably clear geometric rule. Jane's been to Portugal means she went to Portugal and she has now returned. It is a completed round-trip visit. Jane's gone to Portugal means she is in Portugal right now. It is a one-way vector.
I don't disagree with the definitions.
But think about the practical implications. If Jane is your boss and someone tells you she has been to Portugal, you can ask her for travel tips by the water cooler. If someone tells you she has gone to Portugal, you know you have to cover her shifts for the next 2 weeks. This is a simple, factual, geometric statement of physical location in space and time. There is no psychological framing here. She is either currently in Portugal or she is not. The language demands objective accuracy.
Physical location is physical location, sure.
And we see this strict adherence to factual coordinates in professional contexts as well. In academic writing, the source notes that the past simple is strictly used to state what previous researchers did. For example, previous studies concentrated on teachers. It is an unadorned historical fact placed firmly on the timeline.
Okay, I'll give you the point on the physical location of Jane in Portugal. But your academic writing example completely undermines your timeline theory.
How? It's literally recording history.
Because you're reducing tense in academic writing to mere historical coordinates, and that misses the true power of the language. This isn't just about daily conversation or wait times at a bus stop. This manipulation of time happens at the highest levels of academia. The source material specifically details how tenses are used as deliberate narrative framing devices in research papers.
They still have to follow the timeline.
But they choose which timeline to present. While the past simple might be used for historical facts, the choice to use the present perfect, for example, recent studies have indicated, is used explicitly according to the text to show the current relevance of research. If a researcher writes, "The concern for equity has been a key issue," they are using the present perfect to pull a past event directly into the present debate. It tells the reader, this matters right now. Therefore, the grammatical choice is driven by the intellectual argument the writer wants to make today, not just the physical date the study was published. The writer is manipulating the timeline to serve their narrative intent.
Oh, I get it now. That's totally fair. Skilled writers absolutely utilize these tenses to emphasize certain aspects of their research. However, I must point out that they can only do so because the structural boundaries of the tenses are universally understood and strictly adhered to.
Meaning?
Meaning, if a writer uses the present perfect to indicate current relevance, it only works because the reader objectively knows the formula. The present perfect connects the past to the present. The source material reminds us that when writing, the key to the use of tenses is to be consistent. You cannot randomly jump between a present tense, a past perfect, and a past continuous without utterly confusing the timeline of events. The material specifically highlights that if you change tense, you must include words that show a difference in time, like in 1998 versus now. This proves that the underlying architecture of the language is built on a rigid timeline. Narrative flexibility is merely the paint on top of that structural foundation.
But consistency doesn't mean rigidity. The fact that you have to use signal words like before, after, or by the time when constructing a sequence in the past perfect, as highlighted in the source, shows that the verb tense alone isn't always enough to establish the timeline. We need those temporal markers precisely because the verb's primary job is often about relationship and aspect, not just clock time.
I disagree. The temporal markers just reinforce the GPS data.
Let's revisit the concept of the continuous or progressive aspect, because this is where the timeline really breaks down. The material states that the progressive aspect is used for an event which is temporary or changing. For instance, she is becoming more and more deaf, or they are living in Adelaide as a temporary situation.
Which are measurable facts.
But temporary is a pure psychological perception. Let's go back to the gym example. If I say I go to the gym, I am stating a permanent fact about my identity. If I say I am going to the gym these days, I am signaling that this is a temporary, perhaps fragile new habit. The chronological timeline cannot measure temporary. 5 years might be temporary to a geologist, but it's a lifetime to a dog. The grammar allows us to encode our subjective human perception of duration and impermanence directly into the verb itself.
Oh, I see the angle you're taking. But the source material explicitly defines these temporary states against objective facts. It contrasts I am wearing my sunglasses because the sun is bright, which is temporary, with I wear glasses, which is habitual. Both are observable, objective realities. The grammar simply forces the speaker to categorize the reality accurately.
I still say it's about how the speaker feels about the reality.
Let's look at how the simple past packages these realities. The material breaks down the simple past into highly specific categories: completed actions, a series of completed actions, past habits, and duration in the past. For example, I stayed at a resort for a week. The material is careful to note that even though a week is a long duration, it is treated as a one-time event in the simple past. It is treated as a single, sealed block of time. This is not about the speaker's emotional experience of the resort. It is about neatly packaging a chronological event into a closed structural unit so it can be placed on the timeline.
But doesn't that closed structural unit interact differently when you introduce another tense? Look at how the simple past interacts with the continuous tense in our sources. The text describes actions that interrupt another action in the past. It gives the example, I was watching a great video when I decided to subscribe.
Right, an interruption. Sequence.
It's more than sequence. The long action was watching is violently cut across by the short action decided. The contrast between the past continuous and the simple past creates a vivid, dynamic scene. It creates tension. The speaker chooses to frame the watching as an ongoing landscape and the decision as a sudden lightning strike across that landscape. If they merely wanted to state facts, they could say, I watched a video and I subscribed.
Which would also be grammatically correct and chronologically accurate.
Yes, but they don't say that. They use the intersecting aspects to convey the experience of the interruption. This is deeply narrative and deeply psychological. It shows how the language allows us to construct a subjective reality for the listener.
Okay, the lightning strike analogy is great, but that interruption only functions because the past continuous objectively signifies an action in progress at a specific time, and the simple past objectively signifies a completed point in time. The tension you describe is just a byproduct of mathematical intersection, much like two lines crossing on a graph. The rules governing this are strict.
They are flexible enough to convey feeling.
The source emphasizes that the interrupting action is always in the simple past. You cannot say, I watched a video when I was deciding to subscribe. The grammar prevents you from warping reality. The underlying logic of the language is constantly working to maintain an accurate, objective record of events. Consider the past perfect again. The store had already closed by the time I arrived. The action of closing is completely finished before the arrival. The language demands that we sequence these events correctly to avoid historical chaos.
The very existence of multiple ways to describe the past proves my point. Why do we need 12 combinations of tense and aspect if a simple timeline would suffice? The material points out the subtle difference between he left when I came in and he was leaving when I came in. It's completeness versus ambiguity. The simple past, he left, implies a completed sequential action, but he was leaving implies an incomplete action, one that was interrupted. And as the text notes, he may have changed his mind and stayed. The objective timeline cannot handle what-ifs or almosts, but aspect can. Aspect allows us to capture the ambiguity of the moment, the unfulfilled intentions, and the nuances of human interaction. The grammar is a tool for capturing the messy, subjective nature of living, not just for cataloging dates and dimes.
Let's take a step back and look at the third conditional, the exact grammar we use for the what-ifs and almosts of life that you just mentioned. This actually proves why we need strict rules. Our sources cover the third conditional, which relies entirely on the precise application of the past perfect to communicate unreal situations in the past. Go on.
If she had arrived earlier, she would have caught the train. The objective reality is that she arrived late and she missed the train. The only way we can effectively communicate an alternate reality is by relying on the rigid structure of the past perfect tense. The structure acts as an anchor. It tells the listener, we are now operating in the past of the past in a scenario that did not occur. Without that objective, recognizable grammatical structure, the listener would have no way of knowing whether we were talking about reality or imagination. The chronological framework is what makes sophisticated thought possible.
I agree that the structure is necessary to anchor the thought, but the purpose of that structure is entirely emotional and subjective. Look at the exact next use of the past perfect in the material, to express regret.
Regret about a past action.
Yes, but the text offers the example, I wish I had traveled more when I was younger. The speaker is manipulating the past perfect tense not to map out a timeline, but to express a deep psychological longing. They are using the grammar to convey an emotion about an absence of an action. The language isn't acting as a clock here. It's acting as a mirror reflecting the speaker's internal state.
It still relies on the past tense.
Let me give you an even better example of aspectual manipulation from the text. The phrase, I had been hoping you could help me, is cited as a polite or indirect request. The past continuous tense is being used not to describe the past, but to soften a present demand. The speaker isn't saying they hoped in the past. They are using the past tense to create psychological distance and therefore politeness right now. That is pure manipulation of the timeline for social grace.
That is a fascinating usage, but think about why it works. Using a past tense to create distance for politeness works precisely because the past tense objectively indicates distance. The emotional nuance is piggybacking on the objective chronological reality of the tense. The listener feels the politeness because they unconsciously recognize the structural distance of the past perfect continuous GPS coordinates.
Piggybacking or not, the subjective feeling is the primary goal of the sentence.
Let's return to the core mechanics for a moment, because the source material outlines how the past perfect continuous focuses intensely on the duration of an action. He had been waiting for 2 hours when she finally arrived. The text emphasizes the waiting, 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 waiting. This is an objective measurement of time, 2 hours, placed strictly before another event. The function is to establish the exact sequence and duration. It is about quantifying the action on the timeline.
I just don't buy that it's purely about quantification. If it were just about the math of the timeline, the simple past would be enough. He waited for 2 hours, and then she arrived. That covers your sequence and your duration perfectly.
So why use the continuous?
Because the speaker specifically chooses had been waiting to emphasize the experience of the wait. The continuous aspect stretches the verb out, making the listener feel the weight of those 2 hours. It conveys the impatience, the ongoing state of anticipation. The grammar mimics the psychological experience of time passing slowly. This is the brilliance of aspect. It allows the speaker to convey not just that something happened, but what it felt like as it was happening.
It seems we have reached the point in our discussion where we should draw our concluding thoughts, and I think that distinction between what happened and what it felt like is the perfect pivot point.
I agree.
Throughout this debate, I have maintained that while speakers certainly use tense to emphasize different nuances, and you've provided excellent examples of that, the objective chronological timeline is the absolute master of the English verb. Whether it is the strict sequence of events enforced by the past perfect, the clear, undeniable physical reality in been versus gone, or the logical limits imposed on stative verbs, English grammar acts as a reliable, objective clock.
It is this rigid structural foundation, the uncompromising rules of sequence, duration, and completion, that allows any nuance, politeness, or subjective interpretation to exist in the first place. Without the mathematical reliability of the timeline, our communication would collapse into ambiguity.
And I maintain that the true genius of the English verb system lies not in its rigid clockwork, but in its aspectual flexibility. While chronological rules are undeniably necessary as a baseline, I will give you that. The complex tenses we've discussed today exist to serve the human experience. They allow us to stretch time to convey impatience, to emphasize temporary states over permanent realities, and to signal the present relevance of past events through our grammatical choices. Aspect is the psychological lens through which we view the timeline, and ultimately, our perception of time is far more vital to human communication than a sterile record of the clock.
This has been a truly illuminating exchange. We've seen how English grammar operates in a highly sophisticated dual capacity, functioning simultaneously as an uncompromising chronological clock and a highly flexible psychological lens. For those studying the language, our sourced materials suggest there is a vast landscape still to explore in how these tenses can be utilized to express the exact nuances of human experience and historical reality.
Indeed. The tension between the rules of time and the messy reality of experience is exactly what makes the language so deeply expressive.
We will leave it to our listeners to form their own conclusions on whether strict chronology or subjective aspect is the true master of the English verb. Thank you for joining us on The Debate.